Hi guys, welcome to the latest instalment of Anatomy Physiology lectures. This one is the cardiovascular system. So pretty obviously from looking at the picture on screen, we're talking about the heart and associated blood vessels that run around the body in this one. We'll look at the functions of the cardiovascular system. We'll look at obviously the different components found within the heart and those blood vessels that you see on screen there. And of course we'll look at how exercise affects these parts as we go through our life cycle. So diving in, we'll start with the bits. So what is the cardiovascular system? It is effectively a transport system in the human body that delivers blood to the different cells of the human body. Its main components are of course the heart, which acts as the pump, the blood vessels, which are the highways for, or the pipes for sending blood through, and of course the blood itself, which has its own properties and components that we'll learn about as we go through this. The functions of the cardiovascular system can be broken into four main areas. First of all, we have homeostasis of fluid balance. We've then got temperature control, known as thermoregulation. The blood has the ability to protect us in a number of ways. And of course it is the major transport system of the human body. So we'll dive into each of these functions and have a look at them in a bit more detail. And this is accessible content that we're looking at here, so important that you learn and understand this information. So a nice simple one to start, along with the lymphatic system, which is another network of vessels that runs through the body. Okay, so first one is fluid balance, along with the lymphatic system, which is another network of vessels carrying fluid through the body. Blood essentially carries any water around the body to and from tissues as required. If we were to consume a large amount of fluid all at once and that was to enter the bloodstream very quickly, then the body would try to achieve homeostatic fluid balance again by removing the excess fluid. The blood would carry the additional fluid to the urinary system, to the kidneys, which would pass it on as urine down into the bladder, and of course we'd pee it out, and thus we would stabilise the water content and balance within the body. Thermoregulation is all about keeping a homeostatic temperature level within the body. So you've got blood receptors, both floating in your blood and also receptors that are found in major pathways for blood, so in certain arteries and entry and exit points to organs. You've got these receptors that are constantly monitoring the temperature, primarily within the blood. And when the hypothalamus determines that there is too high a temperature going on in the core, then we initiate thermoregulation activity to try and get it back to 37.2 degrees that we like to sit at. So how that works is blood plasma will pick up the heat from the source of the heat production, and often that's going to be muscle, and it's going to transport it via blood vessels to the skin for removal. And in terms of encouraging that process, what the cardiovascular system can do is that the blood vessels between the origin of the heat production and the skin, where it ultimately needs to reach to be evaporated, they'll open up, and that's called vasodilation, where the blood vessels open up to allow more blood flow to occur there. And you can often see that in a hot person by the colour of their skin. You can see a lot of blood reaching the skin, and that's why they're going red in colour when they're very puffed and hot. The heart will also assist the process by raising heart rate to ensure that this process is carried out as quickly as possible. And the ultimate goal is to evaporate that heat and help balance out our core temperature again. So thermoregulation is one way that it's protecting us, and other ways that the cardiovascular system, including blood, protects us is we have components within the blood whose major role is the protection of the human body. Leukocytes, known as white blood cells, will basically attack anything foreign that comes into the body. They'll surround it and deal to it on site if possible. Otherwise they may try to escort it to places of removal such as the kidneys or the liver. Antibodies are also found within blood, and they help to neutralize toxins and help destroy any microorganisms that we might not want in there. And then you've got your platelets, which are essentially small cells that float within the blood whose job it is to initiate clotting when they see a rupture occur within a blood vessel. So if you cut yourself, blood starts to spill from that cut vessel, then the thrombocytes or platelets will come and form a clot over that area. And then you've also got the situation where the body might get too cold. And in a situation where the body gets cold, your blood vessels to your peripheral limbs, your arms, your legs, etc., will actually vasoconstrict. They'll shut down blood flow to those areas, so reduce blood flow, and try to keep the core nice and warm. And you can see evidence of that on cool days where your fingers and toes are generally the first thing that get cold. You might notice that your hands go quite white when they're cold, and that's simply a function of the fact that there isn't as much blood flowing through them. So your body panics, I guess, a little in this sense, and is basically willing to sacrifice your hands and feet and even your arms and legs to keep the core warm. And it makes sense from a survival point of view. If you can keep the major organs, the vital organs functioning, then you'll stay alive, even if you have to lose a hand or foot to get there. And the final one is transport. Probably the primary role of the cardiovascular system is the transport of gases and nutrients to and from the organs of the body. So blood picks up oxygen from the lungs and takes it out to the other organs, and of course one of the major uses of that is muscle tissue when we're exercising. It also then picks up CO2 produced in all cells and takes it away to the lungs so we can breathe it out and get a balance of gases back into our bloodstream. It also carries nutrients from the digestive system, from the gut, and takes it to either places of storage like the liver or out to the organs such as muscle for storage. It also carries waste to the liver and kidneys for detoxification and removal. It's also the main network of travel for hormones. So hormones are released from certain cells in the body and deposited into other cells via blood. And we've just talked about on the last couple of slides the role of getting rid of heat or excess heat from the internal core and taking that to the skin. So without the cardiovascular system, obviously transport really wouldn't occur to a large degree in the human body. Alright, so moving on, the main player in the cardiovascular system is obviously this guy on screen, the heart. And you can kind of see where the traditional love heart version of the heart comes from here. You've got these top chambers that sort of stick out here, and then the bottom chambers down here, which are much bigger. You'll also see the blue blood vessels that are on here, and we'll talk about these blood vessels that actually supply the heart muscle with blood soon. So the heart, what is it? It's effectively, I would say, the world's most efficient pump. I think recently the oldest woman in the world died at around almost 130 years old. So from the moment she was forming inside her mother's uterus, effectively the heart started beating and didn't stop, hopefully, until she reached about 130 years of age. So that's a pretty efficient pump. I don't know of another pump that can keep going for 130 years without some pretty serious maintenance going on to it. So from the moment your heart starts beating until the moment it stops, it works tirelessly without a break. In an average lifetime, based on an average life cycle, the heart would beat more than 2.5 billion times without ever pausing to rest. And we talk about a situation there where people that are less knowledgeable in the area of exercise and how it affects the cardiovascular system, they might argue with that information, well, surely exercising wastes heartbeats. If you can keep your heart rate down for long periods of time, then obviously you wouldn't use up your 2.5 billion beats and you'd live longer. And that sort of shows a little bit of ignorance, because of course when you exercise and become fit, we know that your resting heart rate actually sits lower than it normally would. So you're not exercising all day. You may exercise for a short period of time, and the net result of that is a reduction in resting heart rate for the other hours of the day. So obviously you'll save heartbeats throughout the day and effectively save heartbeats across your life cycle by being fit. So that's the argument you follow up with if anyone ever pulls that line on you. So a couple of facts about the heart. Your heart is roughly the same size as your fist. So bigger people have bigger hearts, smaller people have smaller hearts based on that. And as your body develops, your heart grows at the same rate as your fist. So a newborn baby's heart would be effectively the size of their tiny little hand in a fist. And of course, in a full-grown adult, you can get an indication of who's got a big ticker around you by looking at the size of their hands. In the early stages of development as a fetus, your heart actually fills the majority of your torso. So you've got a heart, you've got some blood vessels, and of course that's required to initiate the growth and delivery of growth material to your body's sections while you grow. So the heart is an established quantity first. The heart size to body size ratio is 9 times greater when you're a fetus than when you're born as an infant. And from that moment on, it continues to grow at the same rate as your fist, as discussed. So there is a heart in a picture here. There's a real heart, and this is a pretty healthy heart. And I can tell that because I can see lots of lean tissue here. I mean, the heart is a muscle after all, and we don't want a muscle riddled with fat. You know, it would be an ineffective muscle. So you can see lots of lean tissue here. You can see good vascular networks going on in here as well. You can see a little bit of fat lay down around these yellow bits here, but effectively a nice lean heart. It is a specialized muscle, but just like any other muscle, and the muscles we've learned about in muscle physiology, it still has actin, it still has myosin, and the sliding filament theory still abounds. But in this case, we're talking about a muscle that squeezes in nature. So I guess the only similar one in the human body, other than the heart, would be something like a sphincter, which would squeeze shut. And in this case, it's designed to squeeze and, of course, eject blood from its chambers. Like any other muscle, we know it needs a constant supply of oxygen and nutrients to stay alive. So it's probably one of the shortfalls of the heart by design that it can't extract oxygen from the blood that flows through it, because we know that blood is flowing through this heart in an effort to get pumped to the rest of the body, but we can't derive any oxygen from that blood. Instead, what has to happen is the blood has to exit the heart through the top here. It has to then hook back around, and you see these blood vessels on the outside of the heart. Well, these are delivering blood to the heart muscle. And if those block, of course, then you're going to end up with a situation where a part of the heart muscle dies, and we'd call that a heart attack. So let's have a look at these blood vessels a little more closely that feed the heart. So here in red we see the largest artery of the body, the aorta. And this is where all blood is ejected from the left ventricle of the heart and pumped out to your body tissue to keep it alive. And you can see before the blood exits and goes out to the rest of the body, there are 2 branches that occur out of here. And these are called your coronary arteries. So you've probably heard coronary in the sense of a coronary bypass surgery. And in the case of a coronary bypass surgery, one of these branches here has been blocked by an increase in cholesterol in the walls of the artery there. So what a surgeon would do then is take some vascular tissue from another part of the body and simply graft it on here and bypass the blockage and insert it back into the blood vessel further down so it can continue to feed blood, oxygen, nutrients, etc. to the muscle to keep it working. So coronary artery is the most vital artery in the body, essentially, to keep our heart pumping. So they're the vessels that bring blood to the heart muscle. They're the first vessels that branch off the aorta, as we saw in the picture before, and it's the blockage of one of these vessels that is the leading cause of death in our society in the term of a myocardial infarction or a heart attack. Typically, there's one artery on the right side and one on the left, and the left one is generally larger for reasons that we'll understand more soon. The left coronary artery then divides into 2 sizable branches which supply different parts of the heart, so around the back and down one side of the heart. The right coronary artery supplies the back of the heart. So, little video, and we're not going to watch all the segments of these videos, but I will talk through a couple of these to give us a bit of a better understanding of how this all works. So we'll just wait for this thing to kick in. Okay, so here's a little video showing the coronary arteries in red, which are delivering blood to the heart, and the blue ones here we see are coronary veins, which then take the blood back into the heart once the oxygen and nutrients have been derived. So we can see that branching off at the top of the aorta there and then delivering blood to the heart muscle, and you can see that's what's allowing the muscle to pump effectively with an ongoing contraction right throughout your life cycle. And you can start to see that there are multiple contractions going on here, and this is a look inside the muscular wall here, how the blood vessel penetrates in. These would be actin and myosin fibers in here, the myofibrils of the muscle fibers. And of course, we get some contraction of those fibers. Now, the blood vessels penetrate deeply into the myocardium or muscle there, and have to obviously get to each part of the muscle fibre. So a few factors can affect the healthy heart. One of them is blood pressure, and we'll talk more about blood pressure soon. And the other thing that really affects the heart is how much oxygen the body is requiring. That will really start to ramp up the heart function. So here we see blood sort of entering and then being pumped around the body, and you can see there are two distinct contractions, one at the top here and then one at the bottom. And we're going to get into that next when we look at the way that the heart contracts. So before we go on and get into the different parts of the heart and how the heart contracts, it's really important that you understand one thing here. Firstly, you can see that the heart is very central to the midline of the body. If anything, it tilts slightly left, so it's slightly lower on the left side here. There's a larger left ventricle on the left side, which is pumping blood out to the rest of the body here. And when you look at a heart anatomically in a book or a picture or diagram that's about to come up, you've got to imagine that that's a heart in a person's chest that's facing you. So the left side of the heart is actually on the picture's right, and the right side of the heart is on the picture's left. Just like a person's eyes when they're facing you. If an eye is on your right side, it doesn't make it their right eye. It's, of course, their left eye. So we have to remember that when we're labelling our tasks here that are coming up. Okay, so we're just going to skip through that little video there and go straight to the picture here. So what we're looking at here is blood flow through the heart, and this is a testable component of the anatomy cardiovascular course. You will have to be able to identify the key parts of this process and the order in which blood flows through the heart. So I'm going to flick on to the next slide, and you guys will have a copy of this as part of your additional notes on Moodle, and also if you've got the paper copies from class, you'll be able to see this picture here, which is a blank heart. So we're looking at a picture of the heart right here. I'm just going to grab the blue colour, and we're going to start here down the bottom of the heart and at the top of the heart here. And these are two of the main blood vessels that are bringing back blood from the body. So this bottom one that I'm showing you right here is a vein, and we know it's a vein because veins bring blood directly back to the heart, so they're the direct connections into the heart coming back from the body. And we would have things, blood vessels bringing blood back from below the heart, so this would be coming from your gut and your legs and those kind of places. And then also blood would be returning to the heart from above the heart, so this could be coming up your arms, past your shoulders and into your heart that way, or down from your neck as it comes back from the brain. Okay, so you can see the blood coming in from the top, coming in from the bottom, and these are flowing through systemic veins. So number 8 and number 2 would be labelled as systemic, S-Y-S-T-E-M-I-C, veins. The blood is then going to come into this top chamber that we see right here. So one would hook up from underneath and hook into here as well, and the other would come in from the top. And this is known as the right atrium. It's on the left, but of course it's in someone else's chest, so this is known as the right atrium, A-T-R-I-U-M. This is a collecting chamber for blood that's flowing back from the body. It's come back to the heart so it can be sent off to the lungs to receive new oxygen. And we're representing it in blue because blood that is returning from the body tissues is depleted in oxygen and therefore tends to be a bluish purplish colour. And you can often see that in your own veins when you look down at your arms. You can see that the colour of the blood running through just under the skin surface is quite dark in nature. Now at this point, the valve, which we'll discuss later, is going to pop open with a little bit of pressure from the atrial wall. So here we see this checkered surrounding here around the atrium. That's muscle tissue, and that muscle is going to cause a little squeeze or compression, and it's going to force the blood to flow down through the gates here and into what we call the right ventricle. So number 7 is the right ventricle, V-E-N-T-R-I-C-L-E. And a ventricle is a pump. And in this case, it can be useful to remember a vent. The job of a vent is to let air out of the building. And in this case, we're letting blood out of the heart. So we're about to eject the blood out of the heart and off to somewhere else. So the gates will close behind the blood after it's flowed through. And then the strong muscular walls of the ventricles, you can see here much thicker, will send that blood shooting up through this other valve here, up what we call the pulmonary trunk. Now the word pulmonary or pulmonic refers to anything to do with the lungs, and in this case this blood is off to the lungs to pick up fresh supplies of oxygen, and we'll see it go right and left as it heads to the right and left lungs. So we hook off this way, the stuff will go behind, and you can draw this in on your picture as you go, and it's going to exit out through these. Now these blood vessels are directly leaving the heart, and any blood vessels that carry blood directly from the heart are known as arteries. Now arteries that are going to the lungs have the word pulmonary in front of them because they are going to the lungs, and that distinguishes them from other arteries in the body. So number 9 and number 3 on your picture here are known as pulmonary, P-U-L-M-O-N-A-R-Y, arteries, because they are leaving the heart. At this point, the blue blood is finished with, because we've entered into the lungs and we've picked up fresh supplies of oxygen, which is bound to the red blood cell and caused them to glow red. And we'll see that nice red blood enter back into the heart via these two vessels here, and of course coming back from both sides, these two vessels here, because we're coming back from the left and right lungs, oxygenated. Number 4 and number 10 we're looking at here, bringing back freshly oxygenated blood into the heart. Well, these are blood vessels that are entering the heart, just like these two blood vessels over here. So they must be veins, but in this case they are coming back from the lungs, so they're known as pulmonary veins. Number 4 and number 10, pulmonary veins. So we now have systemic veins coming back from the body's systems. We have pulmonary arteries taking blood away from the heart to the lungs. And we have pulmonary veins bringing that same blood back, but full of oxygen. And at this point, the blood is going to pour into the second of our top chambers, this time the left atrium. So we'd have blood pouring in through number 10. It would also travel behind the heart here through number 4 and pour in to the left atrium, as so. Number 11, the left atrium. We'd see a small compression of the muscles surrounding the left atrium, sending blood to flow through the valve, which pops open. Again, we'll do the valve names later. The valve would then shut behind that blood as it comes through, and a powerful contraction of this thick muscle here, known as the myocardium, around the left ventricle, will shoot blood up through this valve here. It'll travel behind the pulmonary trunk and come out into this massive artery here called the aorta. So number 1 is the aorta, and number 14 here is the left ventricle. Now the left ventricle is much thicker, and we learned before that the coronary arteries branched and delivered more blood to the left side, and that's because we have far more musculature around this area here. Now the musculature is required there more so than the right side, because if you think about it, this ventricle pump is only pumping blood next door to the lungs and back. Whereas this ventricle is pumping blood to the entire body, up to the head, down to the toes, and has to get that blood back again. So it needs a much more forceful pump. Here we see some of the blood hook around, travel down behind the heart, and descend out here through what we call the descending aorta. And that's off down the middle of your torso to feed your gut, your legs, and other parts of the body below the heart. Whereas these guys up here will branch off, and some will go down the arm, some will go to the head, and these are known as systemic arteries because they're carrying blood directly away from the heart and they are going to the body's system. So they are the systemic arteries as opposed to the pulmonary arteries down here, which are only going to the lungs. Now, one last interesting thing to note. Virtually all of the arteries in the human body are going to be carrying red oxygenated blood out to the body tissues to deliver oxygen and nutrients. Whereas virtually all the veins of the human body will be carrying blue blood, which has been deoxygenated. The only time that that's not true is when we have the pulmonary system here, because we have a pulmonary artery carrying blue blood on the way to the lungs to get new oxygen. And then we have pulmonary veins carrying red blood. So the pulmonary system are unique vessels in the sense that they carry deoxygenated blood away from the heart and oxygenated blood back to the heart. in their arteries and veins respectively. Okay, so that's all the structures we need to be really aware of, except for the valves, but we'll talk about the valves and add them into the mix in a future look at this. Okay, so that's the major structures of the heart sort of covered there. I guess the key ones to go away with and try to remember are the atriums up the top here and the ventricles down the bottom, and also the major blood vessels that are exiting and entering the heart. So entering the heart are veins, either from the system, being systemic, or from the lungs, being pulmonary, and then the major vessels that are leaving the heart, either the pulmonary arteries or the systemic arteries that are leaving the heart out to the body. We'll readdress some of that stuff as we go through too. So the following couple of slides are really just word versions of what we've learned in the picture. Okay, so if you're an image person, that's probably enough for you just to look at those pictures and study them up. If you need the words to help back it up, here they are. So we'll whip through these nice and quick. So the right and left atria, which is the plural for atrium, receive the blood returning to the heart. The right atrium receives blood from the body, and the left atrium receives blood from the lungs. And then you've got the right and left ventricles, which are the pumps, and the right ventricle is pumping blood to the lungs, while the left ventricle is pumping blood out to all of the other parts of the body. And we've already established that the muscle is much thicker around the left ventricle because of the job that it has in pumping blood around the entire body. So it's a pretty important role, obviously. Every single cell of your body needs a continuous supply of nutrients and oxygen and a continual removal of carbon dioxide. And that's the basic information that we always have to keep in mind, because it helps explain why changes occur within the heart when we start exercising. And of course that is to increase delivery of those things to the muscles and the removal of the waste. So far we've introduced a couple of blood vessels. We've introduced arteries, which carry blood away from the heart, and veins, which carry blood back to the heart. There are actually 5 key blood vessel types or categories that we need to be aware of. So before we go on, we need to learn these other blood vessel types. And here you see them in a list. And this is a list, this is the order that I'd like you to learn these things in, because this is always the order in which blood flows through this branched network of vessels. Okay. So we know that blood leaves the heart directly through arteries. And let's establish one of these arteries now. You've got an artery running right down your femur in your thigh. That's known as the femoral artery. Now that artery is like the main pipe, okay, the main deliverer of blood. But along its length, there are branches that are coming off it. And you can see it in this little picture here. There's the main artery, and then it's branching into some smaller blood vessels here. Now these blood vessels it branches into directly are called arterioles, so smaller versions of arterioles. And they have a very interesting function that we'll talk about soon. The arteriole's job is to pass on that blood to even smaller blood vessels found within the body, and these are known as capillaries. So you can see the capillary network here. Capillaries are the blood vessels that actually interact with body cells. They wrap around body cells, and they have very thin walls, capillaries, so thin in fact that a lot of things can pass through, such as fluid, gases, and nutrients. So it's through the walls of these blood vessels that we exchange the gases oxygen and carbon dioxide, as an example. And when we talk about delivering fuel to muscles, we're talking about delivering it through the walls of the capillaries and into the muscle tissue or cell tissue. And what this picture over here indicates is that this process is not broken. So no blood vessel effectively ends at a stop point. Okay. Otherwise, blood would have to backtrack up the same one. And we know that doesn't happen. We know that blood is a circular or circulation-based system. So it has to keep moving in one direction. So it simply wraps around or touches the cell, which would be enveloped by this capillary network, and then drains blood back towards the heart. So you imagine blood coming from the heart, flowing down this artery, branching into the arterioles, into the capillaries, exchanging the oxygen for carbon dioxide. At this point the blood's turning blue, and then this blue blood coming back through the capillary network, draining into a smaller version of a vein known as a venule. And these include many of the things you actually see, the smaller blood vessels you see in your own wrists and forearms, etc. The smaller ones are venules that are feeding into the big veins that were attaching to the top and bottom of the heart and dumping into that right atrium, and they're known as the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, but we've learned them on the picture as systemic veins. So, arteries feed arterioles, which feed capillaries. That's where the exchange occurs, and then we drain that blood back towards the heart through venules, into veins, back into the heart for the cycle to start again. So I'm just going to skip over that little video and look at this here. You can watch that video in the full Moodle Prezi that's found above this video lecture. And we can see here, just to reiterate, an unbroken network here, with blood simply passing through and touching the cells and passing off its load as it goes by. So, in word form, arteries are the largest blood vessels of the body. They're full of pressure because they're so close, essentially, to the ventricles which are creating the blood pressure, that they're full of pressure themselves. And for that reason, if you cut an artery, you're in big trouble, because, of course, no amount of clotting is going to work to bridge an opening in a blood vessel such as an artery, which has so much pressure flowing through it. There are two types of arteries we've discovered: systemic, carrying blood out to the body, and pulmonary, which are carrying deoxygenated blood out to the lungs. And when we say out to the lungs, we don't mean to the lung tissue, we mean inside the lungs, where it picks up the oxygen from the air inside the lungs after breathing. Now, I mentioned arterioles have a specialized role, and they do. Arterioles are the main effectors of blood pressure, and that's because they have little muscles within their walls which allows them to open or constrict the blood vessel. And by opening, they would allow more blood to flow to certain places, and by constricting, they would limit the amount of blood that is received by certain parts of the body. So when we talk exercise, the vast majority of blood is needed at the working muscles and to take heat to the skin. So we would see a vasodilation of blood vessels towards muscle and towards the skin from the muscle to ensure that the heat is removed. And we would see a consequent constriction of blood vessels in the arterioles towards places like the brain, the gut, and the other places, the other organs that are more active when you're not active. So when you're digesting food, when you're asleep, and those kind of things. So a redirection of blood flow would occur. Capillaries, as mentioned, are the blood vessels that interact with the cells. They're tiny. They're kind of like a thread of cotton in many cases. They have very thin walls, and of course through those walls we can exchange substances and gases between the blood and the tissue that it connects with. And that's how we do this exchange of oxygen, water, electrolytes, and other nutrients. And then the venules will bring the blood back towards the heart. They'll start the process of draining. And we say draining rather than pumping in venules and veins because there's not very much pressure left at this point of the system. So these guys are actively trying to get blood back to your heart, which is quite a hard job. You imagine the amount of blood that's down in your legs, trying to make its way back to the heart when you're just sitting still. So unlike arterioles, the venules don't have any muscles in their walls. They just simply drain the blood back and use the pressure of the heartbeat to help force blood back towards the heart. Now, often they're doing this against gravity. And it begs the question, in a vein that's travelling up your leg, how come if a heartbeat is intermittent, so there's a beat and then a rest phase, why doesn't the blood that's travelling up against gravity simply fall down every heartbeat? How does it actually make its way back to the heart? And the answer to that is down the bottom here. Veins include valves along their length that open and close in sequence with a heartbeat. So when the heart beats and blood is forced up against gravity, the valves then close and catch that blood before the next heartbeat forces more blood up behind it and shoots it up the valve a little further. So therefore, blood inches its way slowly, and about almost 60% of the blood in your body when you're sitting down at rest is trying to make its way back to the top of the hydroslide, if you like, to get the wee journey back down in the artery. So most of it is actually trying to make its way back. And that's why if you've been sitting for long periods of time, you'll find you start to fidget. And by fidgeting and moving, you're actually squishing those blood vessels with the muscles of your legs and aiding the process of blood returning to the heart. It's called venous return, and it's markedly increased when you're exercising because you're pumping those muscles so hard. We know that there are two types of veins. We've got the systemic veins that are bringing the blood back from the body tissue to the heart, and we've got the pulmonary veins which are bringing the nicely reoxygenated oxygenated blood back from the lungs into the heart. Okay, so just to tie off this last little bit here, before we take a break, and we'll cover the subsequent information in a second video lecture. A little bit of an overview of the circulatory system as we've found it so far. The two divisions of the cardiovascular system are, of course, pulmonary, serving the lungs, and systemic, serving the body. The pulmonary system would be thought to include the right atrium and right ventricle, and the pulmonary trunk. And then the blood vessels involved in it would be the pulmonary arteries, arterioles, capillaries, and pulmonary venules and veins as it comes back towards the heart. Then it would enter the systemic system, which includes the left atrium and left ventricle, and then the aorta, and of course the blood vessels would be the systemic arteries, arterioles and capillaries, dropping off the oxygen and nutrients to the body, and then bringing the blood back via the systemic venules and veins. And there we have the two interconnected pumps. So this picture shows it really nicely. It's not anatomically correct, obviously. You've got a heart in the middle here and you've got lungs up above. And we know that's not the case. Lungs would be sitting on each side. And then we've also got the body down here, but of course the heart is in the body, and so are the lungs. So this is used to simplify the process here, okay? You'll notice that certain blood vessels have been cut just to aid your understanding of this, okay? So you've got to understand that when blood leaves the heart to go to the lungs, it does leave via the left and right sides. But in this case, we're going to show it as a circuit, and we'll follow one unit of blood around the body. You can see all the points that you've already identified on the heart picture. You've got your right atrium, your right ventricle, your left atrium, your left ventricle. You've got your systemic veins here, coming in from the bottom and the top, bringing blood back. You've got your pulmonary artery heading off to the lungs, but now we can follow it further and see that split, where it splits from the artery into arterioles, and then finally into the capillaries, which is all this little network here. And here we see oxygen jumping in and CO2 jumping out, and then this nice oxygenated blood now draining back towards the heart via the capillaries, the venules, and then finally the veins. Okay, we're then into the left atrium. We're pumping with this huge ventricle muscle here, this myocardium, out through the aorta, and then we're heading off to the body via the systemic arteries. Here's some coming below the heart, and here's some coming from above the heart. We're branching into systemic arterioles, and then into systemic capillaries. The capillaries are then interacting with the muscle tissue, dropping off the oxygen, picking up the CO2, and we're ready to head back to the heart now with this blue blood through the systemic capillaries, the systemic venules, and move back to the systemic veins and into the right side of the heart. And it's an ongoing process, round and round it goes. So we have a pulmonary circuit to the lungs and back, and we have a systemic circuit to the body and back. And blood always follows the same route, leaving the heart, arteries to arterioles to capillaries to venules to veins, always in that order. And of course these are all going to the lungs and back, so they are all pulmonary, you'll see in front of all those words. And then down here to the body, arteries to arterioles to capillaries to venules to veins, and these are all going to the body systems, so are of course systemic in front of each of those words. This is a key diagram that I want you to be familiar with, okay? Being able to label these key structures on this diagram and explain how blood flows through each part in order. Just to finish, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about these things here. We've just talked about it on the picture, and I think that's the best way to do it. So the pulmonary circuit, we're well aware now, is between the lungs and the heart. And then swip down to here. The systemic circuit, of course, is between the heart and the body tissue and back to the heart. And we've got the order of events here: arteries, arterioles, capillaries, and on the way back, we've got the venules and veins. So last slide, just look at this one here, distribution of blood at rest. As I explained before, the vast majority of your blood is actually trying to make its way back to the heart. It's been out, it's done the job, and here we see 54% of it in your veins simply trying to make it back to the heart to go around the journey again. And as a snapshot of your blood at rest, you can see just under 20% of it is actively travelling between your heart and lungs, either delivering blood to the lungs or taking it back to the heart from the lungs. So you've got roughly 5 to 6 litres of blood in your body, so that constitutes almost a litre of blood passing between your heart and lungs at any point. Slightly less than that is actually being processed by the heart at any one time. And that's not only within the heart muscle getting pumped out to the rest of the body, but also within the coronary arteries and veins that are delivering the heart muscle much needed oxygen and nutrients and removing the waste. Your arteries that are actively delivering blood to your tissues only have 11% of the blood in them at any one time at rest. And that's because there's not a huge demand for blood flow in the body when you're resting. Your capillaries, which are actively interacting with the tissues, only have 5% of the total blood flow in them at rest, again because there's limited demand for oxygen within the body when you are resting. And we'll finish off by and I will show you this information later in a diagrammatic fashion, but what we think is going to happen if we transition from rest to exercise. So if we started exercising now, what you would see is a dramatic increase in the amount of blood flowing to and from the lungs. Also, the amount of blood being processed by the heart. The amount within the arteries would also increase markedly as we need to deliver more blood out to the tissues, and the capillaries would also have a lot more blood in them as we deliver heat to the skin and oxygen to the body tissues. And where would all this additional blood flow come from? From a reduction in blood sitting in the veins, particularly in the lower torso. Because, of course, the muscles will be pumping, it will increase the return rate of this blood so it won't pool and sit in the lower legs. And, of course, we'll have a much more even distribution with more blood going out and then that same blood spending less time coming back. And that's why it's good to move. You know, getting up from sitting after too long, just moving every hour is really important for the health of the system, keeping your blood from getting too viscous or thick, keeping your blood from sitting in one place and pooling down in the legs for too long. You know, oxygenating your tissue. It's really important to get up and increase the balance between venous blood and arterial blood. Well, guys, that's a good place to stop today. What we'll be doing in the next session is looking at measures of the heart and get into some of those exercise-relevant acute and chronic changes and effects that exercise has on the system. Thanks for listening in.